My name is Evan Ash, and I am a second-year PhD student at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm very excited to bring to you today my project, a powerful forum, the National Social Welfare Assembly Comics Project, to this virtual Comics and Popular Arts Conference collection. I hope you enjoy, and please feel free to tweet any thoughts you may have after viewing this presentation to my @ which is listed in this title slide. Without any further ado, let's get going. What is the trajectory of comics during the American mid-century? The most commonly accepted emplotment of comics goes something like this. Superman flies onto the scene in Action Comics #1 in 1938, and superhero comics become immensely popular through World War II. Then, the soldiers return home and Americans are tired of fighting, so superhero sales plummet. This leads to an inward-looking editorial turn from comic book companies who begin to publish more mature, violent comic book stories. This leads to a moral outcry against comics, with psychiatrist Frederick Wertham as its most public figurehead. Insistent that comics are inherently pathological and play a formative role in juvenile delinquency, a wide-ranging anti-comic book movement springs forth in earnest after 1948, coming to a head in 1954 with the comic book hearings of the Senate Subcommittee to Investigate Juvenile Delinquency. These hearings play a formative role in the development of the Comics Code, a tremendously restrictive set of editorial and moral guidelines that doomed comics to a continued perception as campy kiddie fare. But what if it were different? Comics history over-relies on Frederick Wertham as a real-life comic book villain, and moreover, a determinist framing that starts with Wertham and ends with the Comics Code. Lost in this framing are the voices and actions of those that wanted to show that comics could be a positive influence, or at least not a wholly negative one. This project, then, attempts to tread new ground into a reinterpretation of how Americans perceived comic books at a time when they were never more popular or more criticized. The two most important organizations in this story are the National Social Welfare Assembly and National Comics Publications. The NSWA was an administrative confederation of organizations that promoted civic engagement, education, health promotion, and youth development. It still exists today in a different form, the National Human Services Assembly. National Comics Publications, identified here by its bullet logo, formed in 1946 as a merger of National Allied Publications, Detective Comics Inc., and All American Publications. It boasted some of comics' most popular series during the 1940s and 50s, and is the immediate predecessor of DC Comics, which it became in 1977. The partnership began on January 11, 1949, when Vernon Pope, NCP's head of public relations, wrote to the NSWA's assistant director to propose a partnership. Pope was responding in part to the flurry of anti-comics articles and comic book bans gripping the country in 1948. In his letter, Pope proposed to give free space to the NSWA in NCP Comics to spread socially constructive messages, writing, "Unfortunately and inevitably, National Comics, along with other reputable and respectable publishers of comics magazines, is hurt by the current campaign. And naturally, they are anxious to make it clear to group leaders and parents that they are good citizens and should not be confused with offenders in the field." John Moore, the NSWA's assistant director, took the idea to the group's public relations committee, which approved the idea and recommended proceeding in a trial capacity, later known as the experimental phase. The NSWA stipulated that they were to have final approval over all public service comics, free rein to criticize NCP editorial content, and reimbursement for all time spent devising the PSAs. The first official meeting of the supervising board for the newly named Comics Project came in April 1949, and plans for their first strip came a month later. The supervising body of the Comics Project was known as the National Advisory Committee, and had members from the NSWA, affiliate organizations such as the American Jewish Committee and Community Chess and Councils, and representatives from National Comics Publications. The Comics Project's first PSA, starring DC's teen hero Buzzy, ran in 17 NCP titles for the October-November 1949 print run. The story was written by Margaret Dawson, a freelance writer and editor retained by the NSWA, but Jack Schiff, the NCP editor who worked with the Comics Project, received the official credit. Win Mortimer did the inks and pencils, as he would frequently do for the Comics Project. And the strip spoke to the paradigm shift in children's attendance of secondary schooling after the end of World War II. and it received a warm reception in the media from outlets like the New York Times and Time magazine for taking advantage of the wide circulation of comics to spread socially constructive messages. However, the Comics Project found its first major critic in the months after the page's publication. James V. Bennett wrote to Bob Bondi, the NSWA's director, under letterhead of the American Bar Association. However, Bennett had a much higher position that he did not make clear in his letters, director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Bennett inferred his belief that the NCP was using the NSWA as a front to cover for their ostensibly violent crime comics by having a respectable organization in their pages. Bennett also served on a special committee of the American Bar Association's criminal law section dedicated to investing cultural portrayals of violent crime and urging for reform measures. Concerned with Bennett's comments, the National Advisory Committee formed a subcommittee on criteria to assess NCP stories using company editorial policy. They rarely found clear violations, but committee member Margaret de Westfeldt often felt there were violations of the spirit of the code, such as a character taking knockout drops, which de Westfeldt thought nearly as bad as the use of a hypodermic needle, which the NCP code forbade. The NSWA was adept at garnering support for the Comics Project across its affiliate organizations, publishing this promotional booklet in 1955. Here, we see a small representation of the PSA comics published by the Comics Project. The first example stars Peter Porkchops, one of NCP's funny animal stars, in a simplistic good manners story. On the right is one of the Comics Project's most well-known strips, Welcome Amigo, one of several that the Comics Project did to foster cross-cultural unity in the spirit of the burgeoning ideal of consensus that so defined America during the 1950s. By 1950, the Comics Project had routinely been publishing their public service announcement comics monthly in NCP comic books. By the departure of the committee's first chair that year, they prepared multiple reports to release to their affiliate agencies about the project, reflecting the wide degree of research into their own work that they performed. In an undated report, likely from 1950, the committee identified several key points from their research. First was recognizing the wide reach and readership of comics, citing a monthly circulation of 10 million NCP comics with a readership estimated at 4 times that amount. Next was recognizing that public opinion on comics was not monolithic. Those who believe comics waste time, said the report, help to perpetuate daydreaming and contribute to nightmares, are opposed by others who feel that comics help youngsters let off steam, relieve tensions, and give them a sense of confidence with the adult world. The report also identified the frequent criticism of the bad, blocky artwork and cheap production values of early comics. They concluded that there is no objective scientific data at the present time on the effects of media, including comics, on young people, and that the impact of ideas conveyed by the comic medium were undeniable. Yet, firmly, they decided that some comics are better than others by any reasonable standard. When James Skoll, the project's original chair, left in 1950, he left a very positive outgoing report to the NSWA Executive Board. He imparted that the NSWA decided firmly to improve comics rather than oppose them, and made clear that despite initial worries from some members due to the intense controversy over comics in 1948, their fears went mostly unfounded. Beyond James Bennett's negative reaction, the Comics Project was a great success and demonstrated what NSWA organizations were capable of when we worked together. Yet, Skoll felt that there was little way to track the actual effect of the comic pages. The NSWA solved this problem in 1951 and 1952. The first evidence came in a reader study for NCP performed by the Daniel Starch Group, which interviewed over 400 comic book readers split into 209 men and women over 21 and 222 boys and girls between the ages of 8 and 20. The study checked for 3 levels of ad retention, including recalling the ad, remembering who it was for, and indicating that a reader read more than half of it. The NSWA page had response rates to each category of over 50%, though it was more popular with adults than children, ranking first out of 7 ads for adults and third for children. The following year, the NSWA did a comic in partnership with the American Friends Service Committee, where they solicited shoelaces to send to countries in Europe recovering from World War II. The aid project received over 1,000 letters and 2,000 pairs of shoelaces in response, and the contributors to the project spanned age, geographical, and racial and ethnic boundaries. Owing to an increasingly evident moral panic over juvenile delinquency, the United States Senate convened its subcommittee to investigate juvenile delinquency in 1953, and their attention would soon fall on comic books, which significant enough amounts of Americans saw as partially responsible for turning kids into criminals. The hearings came to the front door of the Comics Project, as the subcommittee's chief counsel, Herbert Beezer, showed up and grilled the project's secretary for information. Like James Bennett earlier, Beezer implied that certain people thought the NSWA was being used as a front, and Robinson notes that he seemed evasive when she pressed him on who. He also demanded information on the NCB contacts, namely President Jack Leibowitz, editor Whit Ellsworth, and NSWA liaison Jack Schiff. He asked for a copy of the committee membership, but Robinson only had one copy. He didn't seem too interested in any of them, wrote Robinson, took no notes. The committee had their own encounter with Frederick Wortham in 1954 when he attacked them in an article titled The Curse of the Comic Books, which ran in the November-December edition of the Journal of Religious Education. By this time, the Comics Code was in effect, but Wortham was still not satisfied. He attacked the code itself, a Cincinnati group that was probably the most significant comics evaluator besides the code itself, and the NSWA's Comics Project. For this presentation, it's best to hear it solely in the late doctor's own words. Then, following a long list of the NSWA's affiliate organizations, he wrote, in a predicted response to Wortham, the NSWA wrote to the editors of Religious Education to dispute his claims. Chair Ann Wolfe of the American Jewish Committee headed the response, calling Wortham's claims that their pages were harmful, gross distortions of truth coupled with totally unsubstantiated accusations. Wortham's claim would be ridiculous were it not so outrageous. Despite their PR troubles during these years, the Comics Project found success in a program where they offered free black and white reprints of their comics to organizations that requested them, boasting 65,000 reprints sent during 1954 alone. By the mid-1950s, the committee was very interested in continuing their earlier research on exactly how children interacted with their pages. They wrote to the United States Children's Bureau, who were unable to provide any specific help, but sent a staff member to meet with the NSWA. The staff member, Elizabeth Herzog, helped the committee to come up with 3 core questions, but was otherwise skeptical of the feasibility of testing the effectiveness of the pages. Despite Herzog's objections, the committee continued with an established project that sent copies of their now famous Welcome Amigo strip to 31 Detroit area schools and 6,000 students. Teachers that participated in the project reported that it was easy to fit the comics into their lessons, and their students, who ranged mostly from ages 11 to 14, responded enthusiastically. After the completion of the Detroit School Project, the committee did a self-study of their pages, ending up mostly pleased, but with some, quote, dismal failures. As one reviewer put it, there are successes in the majority of pages, but failures are total flops. By the 1960s, changing tastes in children's leisure and an increasing rate of turnover on the National Advisory Committee led to a downturn of the project. This slump was drastically accelerated by the retirement of NCP editor Jack Schiff in 1967, who had been with the project since the beginning and used his background in politically progressive comics editorial to benefit the project. Schiff's retirement coincided with an industry slump that saw older editors, who were mainly writers, forced out and replaced with artists. As Jean-Paul Gabillet wrote in his Cultural History of Comics and Men, the new editorial personnel were expected to produce comics that would attract the readers of Marvel titles, nowadays no longer receptive to the work of the older generation of editors and writers. Jack Leibowitz, president of NCP, felt that Schiff was irreplaceable and could no longer justify losing ad space in increasingly tight financial times. This caused him to call for a termination of the project on the NCP end. Despite a wildly popular anti-smoking strip done in tandem with the American Cancer Society, garnering close to 1 million reprint requests due to the publication of the famous Surgeon General's report on smoking, and pages done in tandem with the United Nations that received wide adoration, the committee's time drew to a close, with one board member remarking, "It looks like an end, doesn't it?" The NSWA committee wished to continue the project and searched for a new sponsor in the comics industry, but could not find one. The committee was not officially discharged until August 1968, over a year after its final meeting. What, then, was the Comics Project? The NSWA deliberately inserted themselves into the debate over the effects of comic books on children during its most tenuous period, and successfully, along with NCP, weathered the storm of comic book criticism brought on by Frederick Wertham and the Senate Subcommittee to Investigate Juvenile Delinquency. They argued that the comic medium could serve a socially constructive and didactic purpose, evidenced by the millions of reprints sent to schools and community organizations, and the enthusiastic responses from teachers and other personnel that worked with youth. The NSWA, most importantly, recognized the power of the comic book, writing many times that it was the most significant form of printed media introduced to the world, and a uniquely American one at that. This examination of the Comics Project has tried, beyond offering a new perspective on comics in mid-century, to thrust this little-known story into the spotlight and supply a basis for other scholars to work from. Within the files of the Comics Project lie countless avenues for historians to explore the change-filled years of the 1940s and 1950s through the print medium that so enraptured children and adults across the country. It is this author's hope that the countless stories that lie in these yellowing pages might help us conquer the persistent perception of comics as simple kiddie fare and embark on a deeper and more meaningful journey to understand such a vitally important time in American history. Hello, I hope you've enjoyed the presentation today, and I just want to give a couple special thanks before we finish this video here today. First of all, I'd like to thank Linnea Anderson and the staff at the Social Welfare History Archives at the University of Minnesota, where I did the research for this presentation over many months. I would also like to thank Dr. David Cecilia and the entire group in the History 819 Research Seminar for the 20th Century at the University of Maryland this past fall. I'd also like to thank my advisor, Dr. Saverio Giovacchini, for feedback that he gave me on this presentation. And I would also like to thank for this opportunity to present the organizing staff of this Comics and Popular Arts Conference Digital Edition. If you're interested in talking more, or would like to see the original paper that this presentation is derived from, please feel free to email me at the address listed in the presentation with any comments or questions. You can also reach me more directly on Twitter. Thanks for coming out, and have a great one.